What's up, guys? So behind the scenes, I've been working on putting together one of those iceberg charts for serial killers and mass murders that have not been solved to this day. It is an 8-level iceberg, and I'm going to be doing them, I believe, one tier at a time. Just kind of depends on time for the video. So anyway, I'm excited to see how this goes. Let's dive in. The 2001 anthrax attacks. For those of you that don't know, anthrax is a serious bacterial disease that's typically found in sheep and cattle. It causes acute and often fatal, they look like skin ulcers, and humans can also catch it as well. On September 18th, 2001, exactly 1 week after the September 11 attacks, letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to several news media offices and to Democratic senators, killing 5 people and infecting 17 others. According to the FBI, the ensuing investigation became one of the largest and most complex in the history of law enforcement. A major focus in the early years of the investigation was bioweapons expert Stephen Hatfield, who was eventually exonerated. Bruce Edwards Ivins, a scientist at the government's biodefense labs in Fort Detrick and Frederick, Maryland, became a focus around April 4th, 2005. On April 11th, 2007, Ivins was put under periodic surveillance, and an FBI document stated that he was an extremely sensitive suspect in the 2001 anthrax attacks. On July 29th, 2008, Ivins committed suicide with an overdose of acetaminophen, commonly known as Tylenol. They have strong suspicion that Ivins was behind the case, but from what I can see, they don't really have any solid proof. Jack the Ripper. I'm sure many of you know who Jack the Ripper is, but for those of you who don't, he was an unidentified serial killer active in the impoverished districts and in and around Whitechapel in the East End of London in 1888. In both criminal case files and the contemporary journalistic accounts, the killer was called the Whitechapel Murderer and Leather Apron. Attacks by Jack the Ripper typically involved females who lived and worked in the slums of the East End of London. Their threats were cut prior to abdominal mutilations. The removal of internal organs from at least 3 of the victims led to proposals that their killer had some anatomical or surgical knowledge. Rumors that the murders were connected intensified in September and October of 1888. And numerous letters were received by media outlets and Scotland Yard from individuals saying that they were the murderer. The name Jack the Ripper originated in a letter written by an individual claiming to be the murderer that was then disregarded in the media. The letter is widely believed to have been a hoax and may have even been written by journalists in an attempt to heighten interest in the story and increase their newspaper circulation. The Zodiac Killer. He operated in Northern California in the late 1960s. The case has been described as the most famous unsolved murder case in American history, becoming a fixture of popular culture and inspired amateur detectives to attempt to resolve it. The Zodiac murdered 5 known victims in the San Francisco Bay Area between December of 1968 and October of 1969, operating in rural and urban and suburban settings. He targeted young couples and a lone male cab driver, and his known attacks took place in several places, especially near the San Francisco area. 2 of his attempted victims survived. The Zodiac himself claimed to have murdered 37 victims, and he has been linked to several other cold cases, some in Southern California or just outside of the state. Now, something a little bit odd is the Zodiac actually named himself in a series of taunting letters and cards that he mailed to regional newspapers, threatening killing sprees and bombings if they were not printed. Some of the letters included cryptograms or ciphers, in which the killer claimed that he was collecting his victims as slaves for the afterlife. Of the 4 ciphers he produced, 2 remain unsolved, and 1 was only cracked in 2020. While many theories regarding the identity of the killer have been suggested, the only suspect authorities ever publicly named was Arthur Leah Allen, a former elementary school teacher and convicted sex offender who died in 1992. Although the Zodiac ceased written communications around 1974, the unusual nature of the case led to international interest that has sustained throughout the years. The San Francisco Police Department marked the case inactive in April of 2004, but they reopened it at some point prior to March of 2007. The case also remains open in the city of Vallejo, as well as in Napa County and Solano County. The California Department of Justice has maintained an open case file on the Zodiac murders since the year 1969. The Chicago Tylenol murders. The Chicago Tylenol murders were a series of poisoning deaths resulting from drug tampering in the Chicago metro area in 1982. The victims had all taken Tylenol brand acetaminophen capsules that had been laced with potassium cyanide. A total of 7 people died in the original poisonings, with several more deaths in subsequent copycat crimes. No suspect has been charged or convicted of the poisonings. New York City resident James William Lewis was convicted of extortion for sending a letter to Tylenol's manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson, that took responsibility for the deaths and demanded $1 million to stop them. But evidence tying Lewis to the actual poisoning never emerged. The incidents led to reforms in the packaging of over-the-counter substances and to federal anti-tampering laws. The actions of Johnson & Johnson to reduce deaths and warn the public of poisoning risk have been widely praised as an exemplary public relations response to such a crisis. The Lake Bodom murders. And just so you know, I'm probably going to say like all of these names wrong. I'm sorry. Anyway, the Lake Bodom murders. It is one of the most infamous unsolved homicide cases in Finnish criminal history. On June 5th of 1960 at Bodom Lake, 15-year-old girls Malia and Anha and 18-year-old man Seppo were killed by stabbing and blunt force trauma to their heads while sleeping inside of their tent. The fourth person, Niles, then 18 years old, was found outside of the tent with broken facial bones and stab wounds. Despite extensive investigation, the perpetrator was never identified, and various theories on the killer's identity have been presented over the years. Niles was unexpectedly arrested on suspicion of committing the murders in 2004, but he was later found not guilty. The Cleveland Torso Murderer. The Cleveland Torso Murderer, also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, was an unidentified serial killer who was active in Cleveland, Ohio, United States in the 1930s. The killings were characterized by the dismemberment of 12 known victims and the disposal of their remains in the impoverished neighborhood of Kingsbury Run. Most victims came from an area east of Kingsbury Run called the Roaring Third, or Hobo Jungle, known for its bars, gambling dens, brothels, and vagrants. Despite an investigation of the murders, which at the time was led by famed lawman Elliot Ness, then Cleveland's police public safety director, the murderer was never apprehended. The St. Valentines Day Massacre was the murder of 7 members and associates of Chicago's North Side Gang that occurred on Valentine's Day in 1929. The men were gathered at a Lincoln Park, Chicago garage the morning of February 14, 1929. They were lined up against the wall and shot by 4 unknown assailants, 2 dressed as police officers. The incident resulted from the struggle to control organized crime in the city during Prohibition between the Irish Northsiders, headed by George Bugs Moran, and their Italian Chicago outfit rivals led by Al Capone. The perpetrators have never been conclusively identified, but former members of the Eggins Rats gang working on Capone are suspected of a role, as are members of the Chicago Police Department, who allegedly wanted revenge for the killing of a police officer's son. The Long Island Serial Killer is an unidentified suspected killer who is believed to have murdered between 10 and 16 people over a period of nearly 20 years, and to have disposed of their bodies in areas on the south shore of Long Island, New York. Most of the known victims were sellers who advertised on Craigslist. The victims' remains were found over a period of months in 2010 and 2011 after the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert resulted in a police search of the area along the Ocean Parkway, near the remote beach towns of Gilgo and Oak Beach in Suffolk County. The remains of 4 victims, also known as the Gilgo Four, were found within a quarter of a mile of each other near Gilgo Beach in December of 2010. 6 more sets of remains were found in March and April of 2011 in Suffolk County and Nassau County. Police believe the latter sets of remains predate the 4 bodies found in December of 2010. Gilbert's remains were found a year after the remains of the Gilgo Four were discovered. Her cause of death remains contested, with police claiming accidental drowning, while an independent autopsy determined possible strangulation. So please forgive me, because once again I am probably going to butcher a whole lot of these words and names and towns and stuff like that in this article. JAT Flight 367. This was a McDonnell Douglas DC-932 aircraft which exploded shortly after flying over Hermsdorf, East Germany, while en route from Stockholm to Belgrade on January 26 of 1972. The aircraft, which was piloted by Captain Ludwig Redsdre and from Officer Radko, broke into 3 pieces and spun out of control, crashing near the village of, I cannot pronounce that, and Slovenia? I'm sorry. Of the 28 on board, 27 were killed upon ground impact, and 1 crew member, whose name was Vesna, survived. She holds the Guinness World of Records, surviving the highest fall without a parachute at over 10,000 meters, 3,300 feet. The Axeman of New Orleans. This was an American serial killer active in New Orleans, Louisiana, and surrounding communities, including Gretna, from May 1918 to October of 1919. Press reports during the height of the public panic about the killings mentioned similar murders as early as 1911, but recent researchers have called these reports into question. The Axeman was never identified, and the murders remain unsolved. He mainly targeted Italian immigrants and Italian Americans, so this leaves the possibility open that the killings were racially motivated, but as the killer was never caught, this was never conclusively proven. The Villisca Axe Murders. Now this will bring us to our last one in the first tier of our iceberg, so let's get on with it. The Villisca Axe Murders occurred between the evening of June 9th of 1912 and the early morning of June 10th, 1912 in the town of Villisca, Iowa, United States. The 6 members of the Moore family and the 2 guests were found bludgeoned in the Moore residence. All 8 victims, which included 6 children, had severe head wounds from an axe. A lengthy investigation yielded several suspects, one of whom was tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury and the second ended in an acquittal. The crime remains unsolved to this day. If you have made it this far in the video, thank you very much for hanging around to see the end. I hope you enjoyed Tier 1 of the 8-part section of the iceberg I will be doing. I will see y'all with Tier 2 next week. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to help this channel. This is Divina signing off. Good night.